My name is Shannon McFarland. I'm the Director of Content at Securicy. And today we are talking about how to fast track HIPAA compliance for vendors. And today with me, I have our CEO, Darren Gallop, who's a certified information security professional, and the CEO of Securicy, Justin Gratto, our Senior Director of Product, who's also our Security and Privacy Officer at Securicy. Hey, Justin. And what we're looking at today is how can your business become HIPAA compliant, be audit ready, and avoid hefty violations? So what we want to look at and have ask Darren and Justin about is, as security experts, what insights should CEOs, CTOs, and other people in the C-suite know about how their company can become HIPAA compliant, how you can streamline that process to protect your electronic personal health information, and really answer your questions about how to go about this as efficiently as possible. All right, so I'm gonna pass this over to Darren and Justin now. Take it away.
Hey, thanks a lot, Shannon. So yeah, my name is Darren Gallop. I'm the CEO of Securicy. I have a background in the application world. So this is my second tech startup. I've been in the tech space now for about 14 years. I'm also a CISSP, so very interested in cybersecurity and privacy. And we work with a lot of different companies that do everything from healthcare to fintech and all kinds of stuff. So we have quite a bit of experience with companies that are meeting HIPAA compliance.
Hi, and I'm Justin Gratto. My background is coming from the military, but I have been a information security consultant after that. During my time in the military, I spent a fair amount of my experience in information security, and I've been with Securicy for 9 months now, working on their contents, technical content, and security subject matter content.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Justin. So I'm going to dive in. I've got a couple of questions that I prepared that will walk us through a few things. So the first one, could you just sort of give us like a high level, what is HIPAA exactly?
Well, HIPAA is a law that governs the protected health information of U.S. citizens. It means to regulate how health insurers and healthcare providers and healthcare clearinghouses collect, protect, and share patient data.
And HIPAA's been around for a really long time. It was something that came out of the 90s, correct? And it's sort of evolved.
Yeah, 1996.
And it's sort of evolved over time as the world and the way we share data changes. So for companies that are generally being asked about HIPAA or coming to us talking about HIPAA or searching about HIPAA, it's usually because they're asked about their HIPAA compliance. So they're asked or they are mandated by their customer to be HIPAA compliant. So what does HIPAA compliance really mean?
Well, HIPAA compliance refers to, there's several rules in the Act. Two main rules that govern compliance are security and privacy rules, and they're defined in HIPAA. But there's also a breach notification rule that has been expanded upon with high-tech, which we can cover later.
Okay. And so when a company realizes that they need to become HIPAA compliant, really, like how do they get started on that journey?
Well, I would like to say that they would get started on that journey by asking that question, and really what they would go about doing is kind of trying to understand the security and privacy rules and what those requirements mean to the business that they run.
Okay, and so you talked. Go ahead. Sorry.
I could expand a little bit more on the security and privacy rules.
Yeah, I was just sort of curious. So you talked about these rules. I was wondering if you could sort of give a highlight on what the security and the privacy rule actually entails.
Okay. Well, the security rule consists of kind of 3 pillars of safeguards. They are technical safeguards, physical safeguards, and administrative safeguards. The technical safeguards are being the technical security controls, configurations, and infrastructure that you have in place that identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover from incidents that could affect confidentiality, integrity, and availability of patient data, or a common term for this is ePHI in the technology sense, is electronic protected health information. And an example of one of this technical safeguard is end-to-end encryption for in transit data.
Yeah.
Physical safeguard is the physical security controls, infrastructure, and measures in place to protect and detect unauthorized physical access of this ePHI. An example of physical safeguard might be a role-based access control to a data center. So with a lot of our customers too, they're SaaS-based and they use cloud infrastructure. By using cloud infrastructure, you're pretty guaranteed that your physical safeguard is covered for electronic protected health information in the cloud. But if you have any documentation or if you have any physical media that has, that's in your office environment, that also has to be covered and protected physically. And administrative safeguards is the third pillar, and these are the security policies, your procedures, your kind of workflows that are compulsory for an assurance of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your ePHI. An example of an administrative safeguard might be a business continuity and disaster recovery plan.
And so yep, keep going.
So I could go into the privacy rule.
Yeah.
Talk about that. So the privacy rule is related to use, disclosure, procedural, and operational safeguards of PHI. So what your privacy practices in your organization, and defines the privacy rule also defines PHI subjects' rights under HIPAA, what their rights are to, giving the authority to disclose and deny access for this data. Some of the requirements laid out in the privacy rule are having a privacy policy that covers use and disclosure of all the requirements, disclosure requirements, and denial of access requirements that are in HIPAA. And having a publicly available notice of privacy practices that clearly describes what things your company is doing to protect this protected health information, and what your company does as in terms of operational, say who we are going to disclose this information to, who has a right to access, that kind of thing. And appointing a privacy officer is a common. This is someone who's going to be responsible for HIPAA compliance in the organization and is going to be responsible for any complaints received.
Awesome. That's very helpful. So how does a company know like if they need to be compliant? So who essentially has to be compliant with this act?
That's a good question. There's three main entities that are called covered entities that are required to be HIPAA compliant. And then there's one also that I'd like to touch on after I describe those. So there's healthcare providers, which consist of the doctors, your clinics, your hospitals, people that are actually the organizations and people that are actually handling, directly with a patient relationship. Then there's your health plans, which consist of the insurance companies, the HMOs, private sector group health plans, and public sector group health plans. Say, like I was in the military, there was, you have this public sector health. It might be a Blue Cross. It might be in Canada, at least we were using a Blue Cross. In the United States, they have another. It's specifically military healthcare, but that's kind of the idea. Healthcare clearinghouses. Now, healthcare clearinghouses are service providers that do process insurance claims, and they do checks for errors, and they act as an intermediary between an insurer and a provider. And these entities handle ePHI and PHI in several forms when handling claims and checking these for accuracies. Therefore, they belong to a category of a covered entity. The fourth category I'd like to talk about is business associates. Now, business associates are a third party that offers a service or offers a software or something that is to a covered entity, so one of these healthcare providers, insurance companies, or healthcare clearinghouses that provides some service but is not a part of the core workforce, therefore they're third party, and they're covered by something that's called a business associate agreement.
Cool. One of the terms that I often see out there with HIPAA or next to HIPAA is this reference to high tech. So I see a lot of a lot of companies that are exploring compliance with HIPAA that are also looking at high tech. Can you explain a little bit about what high tech is and how it's different than HIPAA?
Yeah, absolutely. So HITECH is an acronym that stands for Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act. This is an act that was passed in 2009 and it began enforcement in 2013. And really, the real question is, like, why does HITECH exist? And it was really, since HIPAA was around since 1996, some of our common, our technological advancements in information technology, in the internet, and how companies are using technology more and more to do business on a daily basis, and with cloud technology and that, those didn't exist in 1996. So there was really, HITECH was an act that came out afterwards to kind of like update it. And there was a few things that it really touched on that weren't really covered, that weren't perfect in HIPAA. So it was modernizing, security and privacy rules for how we, use data in a modern sense, enforcing rules, the enforcement rule to ensure that there's enforcement going on, and breach notification requirements. So defining actual requirements for business associates and covered entities that says, this is the manner in which you're going to disclose that there is a breach and someone's data that links to them has been made public, or it's been leaked to a hacker, or it's even just making mistakes, sending the wrong data. So if you sent mail to the wrong person's address, that's a breach. You're sending someone else's data that doesn't belong to them, that they are not supposed to receive. That's a breach too. And then there's the fourth one, that was the fourth point I want to touch on, was there's making business associates liable for security and privacy. Now, business associates it was more of a physical transaction, and there was more, back in 1996. Now we have, business associates, healthcare providers, insurance companies are using cloud-based services, and they're using third-party vendors more and more and more for productivity, to conduct their business on a daily basis. So making that third party more liable for the security and privacy factors, and breach notification as well, was something that was added with HITECH.
Cool. So one of the things that I get a lot is talking to companies that are outside the U.S. asking questions about HIPAA. So is HIPAA exclusive to companies in the U.S., or do companies outside of the U.S. Need to be conscious of HIPAA as well?
Well, HIPAA is exclusive to the United States, but if you want to sell software to one of these covered entities that resides in the United States, you're going to most likely be put in the situation that you are a business associate and you're signing a business associate agreement. Now, a business associate agreement is an extraterritorial contract. So if you are a if you're a health tech company in Canada or Europe and you're selling to a covered entity in the United States, you're going to be required to be HIPAA compliant. That's part of their procurement process, is making sure that their business associates have a minimum standard of security and privacy.
What about a company? So what if you have a Canadian company, for example, that's selling a B2C product? So they're not actually selling, this is not being mandated as part of a business associate agreement, but they're actually selling a product and they're selling in the US. So they have end users that are entering healthcare related data into an application that is hosted in Canada and owned by a Canadian company. Would that also create a situation where HIPAA would be required, sort of like what you see in GDPR, where if you have the information, it's the law is covering the citizens? Would that apply? Is the similar type of thing for a Canadian company selling directly to the States?
It's not extraterritorial. So if you are not a business associate, you're selling business to customer, you are not required to, but you can receive some bad press if you have a breach. I mean, it's not going to look very good on your business if you're not at least applying those standards.
So what happens? Just sort of curious about consequences. So if you're a tech company and you are, let's just for simplicity, let's assume you're a US based technology company and you are under a business associate agreement with a healthcare provider in the US. And so your software is storing a bunch of HIPAA compliant, HIPAA data, healthcare data, personally identifiable health information. And you have a legal requirement because you're in the States and you're holding you're storing and processing this data, but you also have agreed in a BAA with a customer essentially that you would be HIPAA compliant. So what would be the consequences in the event that you just kind of lied your way through it, or just let your HIPAA compliance lapse and you essentially become non-compliant? And say something happens like a breach where it becomes, obviously something has to happen generally before people know that you're not following the rules. So let's say you're a company that has a breach and you haven't been following the compliance of HIPAA, and now you're facing the wrath. What could that wrath look like?
It could vary. It really depends highly on the degree of negligence. It depends highly on the degree of malintent. If there's because if it was a case of maybe a negligence to respond to enforce good security practices or privacy practices, and you were given notice by the HHS or OCR, which is the Human Health Services and Office of Civil Rights. So if you get notice that we had a complaint from you, and they say that you're not using encryption, you're not doing this, you're not doing something like this. If they have any complaints, and then they perform an audit on you, and this can, if because you're a business associate, so the covered entity can do an audit on you, a request that you provide, proof that you're doing this, and this at any time during that agreement. If they find out that you're not, and you said you were, I mean, that is fraudulent, and you could have private action. So you could be sued by the covered entity. You could be fined if you're US. You could be fined by the Office of Civil Rights. You could be up for any number of violations. Now, specifically, if someone in your company used their ability to access information for such cases as like identity theft or fraud, like that person can go to jail. It's obviously that's a crime, right? So these rules of noncompliance, but for businesses that are not actively engaging in crimes and just negligent, it can be it can be really high fines, anywhere from $100 to like millions. There's limits on per incident or per item, type of incident, but there's also like for the identity theft or fraud. I mean, that's up to the courts, right? Like that's
right. And I guess you also have, I mean, if you're B2C, for example, you could be facing class action suits where, you know, somebody takes leadership, or a legal firm that specializes in class actions in the privacy space could go out there and contact and gather or put an announcement out there for anybody affected by XYZ, and then action a class action from a legal proceed. And then I guess the other one that happens, or that can be detrimental to most businesses, is the fact that all of this stuff, a breach, the findings of non-compliance, any legal actions taken by customers, or in the case of B2C class action, all of these things generate really negative press and can have a massive impact on a company's reputation, which will certainly make raising capital or renewing customers or gaining new customers challenging for some time. So that sometimes, as we see in other types of breaches, where trust and is not, where trust is lost and assurance is lost within the customer base. Sometimes for startups, particularly, this can be more damaging than say the fine or something like that. So that's obviously, in any case when we're talking about fraud or poor security or poor practices in your company, that result in some sort of negative outcome like that, this can be really detrimental to an organization.
In one case, I'd like to point out there was a medical device manufacturers. I mean, it depends on what if it's FDA or if it's HIPAA. But in some cases, I mean, there's cases where there's a software as a medical device, and that's falls under FDA, but it's pretty vague what the defining what is under FDA in this case, right, and what is under HIPAA. So but both, just because it's FDA, there's still like requirements to meet before you release something, and requirements to meet afterwards. In the cases of say software as a medical device, there was cases where these supporting softwares that were connected to medical devices were hacked, and because that there was a exposure to the device themselves, and one of these companies that made these medical devices had to, it was under a name change, but really it was another company acquired them after one of these big events for quite a bit, but still.
And another thing that a lot of people don't think about or consider that can happen internally in an organization when an incident like this happens is it can create wreak absolute havoc on internally in the culture within the team. So often you'll see cases, and this is the stuff you don't hear about as much in the news, but after a breach and all of after everything's been disclosed and you realize the extent of non-compliance or fraudulent activity or delinquents, essentially, you often see scenarios where people on the sales and marketing side of the business or on customer success side of the business can become very upset, quit the business, leave the business, go elsewhere, because they're essentially often you see these situations where internally the language is like, yeah, we follow this, we're compliant, we're HIPAA compliant. So you have marketing people that are generating documentation on the website or stipulations, and you've got salespeople that are walking through sales processes and saying to customers that they're HIPAA compliant because they've heard from engineering or from security or from the CEO that is indeed the case, and then when it comes down that it's not, then they certainly feel mistrusted internally. So it can be, if you have a situation where you're not compliant, and you have a sales and marketing team out there saying that you are, then that can really destroy the culture inside the organization, make recruiting problematic as well. People generally aren't excited when they're recruiting for a job. You're looking for top tier talent. Oh, I want to go to that company that's been lying to their customers and it's been plastered all over the news. Though if your investors leave and a bunch of your customers leave, then you're probably not doing that much hiring. So some other things to consider there. One of the things, so there's a couple of things that I notice when people are initially coming to terms with the fact that they need to become compliant with HIPAA. We see that a lot of the first things people are looking for once they figure out what is HIPAA is, they want to find a compliance checklist. They want to find some high level document that can demonstrate, give them an idea of what are the bases they need to cover. So that, I guess it's sort of like, for most people, it's just sort of quick understanding of like, oh God, how much do I have to do here? How far off are we? So, what are your thoughts on that? Do we have anything we can share? Do you know of any good checklists that people could utilize to say have a starting point, or to get a little bit more understanding of what HIPAA comprehends?
I made a HIPAA compliance checklist. Shannon, do we have that available to share?
Look at you
Yeah, we sure
guys.
do. I'm going to
Genius.
drop that in the chat in just a moment. And we're actually, I want to get to a couple of questions here as well.
Cool.
And so I've got some questions coming in. And Darren, I think this is one you've actually talked with people before and heard them ask you, as well as potentially Justin. So a company is saying, so we don't have healthcare data, but our customers or prospects are still asking us if we're HIPAA compliant. What
Okay.
HIPAA rules actually apply to us?
I would ask them what they think healthcare data is. So I would want to find out what the definition is that they have an understanding of. If that means that their definition means that if it's anything related to a person's health or whatever, that's not entirely accurate. So in a case where it's data that's coming from a certain entity, like a covered entity. So if I have data from XYZ HMO, or this insurance company, or this clinic. So it's a specific clinic. So this clinic it's a cancer or oncology clinic, and that data, if you're supplying name and email address, even just email address and kind of an identifier of who they are, and it's coming from an oncology clinic, I mean, that's healthcare. That's oncology, name and email address. That's
right.
Protected
So
health
the
information.
insinuation there.
Yeah.
I once had a guy come to me, founder of a company, and was like, "Hey, I don't have any healthcare data, but the website was for a very specific illness." So you have to assume, the assumption there being that you would not sign up for this website if you did not have the illness. So the insinuation there is essentially, is a piece of healthcare data. It's information about somebody's personal information related to their health.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing, go ahead. Did you have something to add there?
I was going to just open up a little bit about myself. Like I received some trauma healthcare assistance, and I use some like meditative and some breathing techniques and things like that. So if I use an app that offers this kind of service, and it helps me with this trauma that I undergone in my life, that in itself, I gave you my email address, I gave you my name or some indicator of who I am, such as an email address. It has my location data because it's tracking, it's using cookies, it's tracking where my location is. So email address that has my last name in it, and my initials, and then it's tracking my IP address, which is linked to somewhere close to Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. I mean, that's pretty well showing that like I, Justin Gratto, was receiving trauma treatment, right?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And so, kind of leads into sort of my next point, is where you get a lot of these companies coming in saying, "Oh, this is ridiculous. Like, we're being asked by a customer to be HIPAA compliant, but there's not even any healthcare in there." I think the insinuation is one piece. One of the reasons that auditors will ask for HIPAA compliance, even if they're not actually sharing healthcare data. And again, if you're looking at their business and the nature of their business, if they're a clinic, like you say, then it's insinuative that the data that you would store for that customer So name and email address, linked to that clinic could insinuate, like say if it was a cancer clinic, for example, you'd assume that that person would have cancer if they were a patient at that clinic, right? So that's one reason. Another reason that I've heard from customers that require it is because of scope creep in a contract. So you see a lot of cases where maybe the user base of your particular software, maybe there isn't a current scope to have healthcare data in there. But because your customer is a customer that needs to be HIPAA compliant, it's a lot safer for them to protect against scope creep. So what if in 6 months in the deal, they ask you for a new feature that's a text field, and you start putting notes on customer behavior in there that's more HIPAA related data. So it's a preventative move. And then there's also cases where you just see auditors are like the auditors that work in your customers' companies, the last thing they want to do is come back and give a risk assessment and say, yeah, thumbs up, these guys are good. And then 6 months later, we find out there's a problem. So a lot of the times, a lot of these auditors will sort of lean more on the side of caution. Like if it says to have one fire extinguisher, put 2 fire extinguishers kind of thing.
Yeah, overprescribed.
Overprescribed. Yeah. And so this leads to the other thing, and this is, I see this in HIPAA, but I also see it in every other type of privacy or information security compliance or best practice checklist or whatnot, is companies often, earlier stage companies, say pre-seed, seed stage companies, I hear people say stuff like, hey, we're not going to do that until we weren't going to do anything about our cybersecurity until we hit $2 million in revenue. I've literally heard a person say that, to which, like, I'm biting my lip to not say, like, to not insult this person for being really, really naive and stupid, because that's kind of how I feel when somebody's like, we're going to wait till a customer asks for that, which is one of the things. And I understand, like, that makes sense if it's like something you can just go out and buy. Like, I'm going to wait and then I'll spend the $10,000 when the customer asks me for the thing. That's fine if I could just go to Walmart and pay $10,000 and get a piece of paper and then everything's good. But we see this a lot. Companies wait and they wait and they wait, and then they come running in with their hair on fire. They now need to be compliant with HIPAA, and because they hadn't really taken this seriously early, they have a lot of stuff to do in a short period of time, and so that's the one of the biggest challenges I find. And so the question that we get when those people come is, how long is this going to take? And I'll always say, well, when do you need it? And usually, like, tomorrow. We could probably get by next week. Like, and these are really tough situations, because depending on the complexity of the business, we talked to a company a couple of months ago that we realized they couldn't actually become HIPAA compliant because some of the decisions they had made in sort of where their data was being stored, how it was being stored, the tools they were using, where their developers were located, and how the level of which they offshored stuff. So and so, like, the idea that you can just become HIPAA compliant when the customer asks for it seems to be a really tough one. Do you have any sense to that question? Like, how can you frame up to somebody, what are some of the things they could think about to give them an idea of how long it could take for a software company, say, to become HIPAA compliant? Or would you say just it's totally chaos and really depends, and could be 2 weeks, could be 2 months?
There's a concept of security by design, right? So, so if it is, a customer who is offering a software, web SaaS-based software to a customer, I mean, really, it's like, how, are you already doing a lot of the best practices around security authentication, how credentials are stored, how data is stored, data in transit, access controls, like for the developer environments, for the databases and things that are being used. It really requires a risk assessment. of the business, of what you have already, kind of a gap analysis as well, of like what you have already and what you should be doing, or what is required to be done in order to get you to a point in which you can say, yeah, this is within compliance of HIPAA. So I mean, it could be anywhere from, if you're really messed up, you might never see that checkbox, but if you're already kind of, you're developing with best practice in mind, you have some stuff, you have some things documented. I mean, it could be anywhere between like a couple weeks and months, depending on how much fuel you want to put on that fire, right? How many resources, how necessary it is to get that done in such a short time.
And then the thing that I see a lot of companies really fail to understand or consider in this is that you generally have this sales journey happening with the customer that eventually requests for HIPAA compliance. And so the way that looks is a lot of back and forth, but generally your sales team is really responsive. So when they say, how much is this, or can you do this? Can we jump on a call to talk through this piece? Generally the response time from the sales team is really quickly. So you have this cadence expectation that's set through a sales cycle. Generally, you're very responsive to sell. When I
was going to say, salespeople are good at what they do. They usually are able to sell something really well. They might not be entirely accurate about what they're, what maybe they're promising, or their, full understanding of what is being promised here.
Right.
But they're gonna tend towards, yeah, we'll do it. We'll figure it out. Right.
Yeah, but what I see a lot happens though is that the cadence goes from a really quick cadence to a really big delay. So the cadence changes because now the customer goes, hey, here's the security questionnaire. We're just sending this questionnaire to assess your HIPAA compliance. So they have X amount of questions, whether it's 20 high-level questions or 150 really granular questions. And so now you've had this cadence where everything they've asked for, you've been really quick because you have an answer, right? Because you know your product, you know your market, you know what you're doing, you know your pricing. When you don't have that same delivery and that same confidence expressed through the process, once you get to the security questionnaire. So when now there's a 2-week delay to answer the security questionnaire, and there's this putting off and there's this whole change in that cadence, it starts to erode the trust on the other side. So any experienced third-party security auditor knows generally the difference. I can say, like, I can talk to a founder and ask them like 3 or 4 questions in the period of like minutes and have a good understanding if they actually have an information security program in their business or if they're just trying to skate around it. It's just super obvious. We look at a lot of the questionnaires that our customers answer, and we see this all the time where you end up calling them and be like, hey, you can't say that, right? So the delay and the lack of knowledge about it, this is one of the biggest things that I see erode confidence when you get down to into a deal, and you're not ready. You've waited for the deal. Now the deal's on your doorstep.
Yeah, so I've got a question here that kind of gets into that idea of like the deal being on your doorstep. So if you've got a deal on your doorstep and a business is, I've got here, the question is, if our business is trying to shift to serve healthcare entities right now, how do we get started with HIPAA compliance? And Justin, I think one of your answers is probably going to be something about the checklist that we have in the handouts right now.
Yeah, I mean, I would start with the checklist, and it's set up in two ways. It's really around the security and then privacy items that are kind of, this is a necessary, and in that there's also, in the security, it touches on, need risk assessment done on the organization, need a risk assessment done on the ePHI systems. So that being said, you're really, what that is looking at is what are the threats to it. If those threats were successful in manifesting, what would be the outcome? And then based on those highest outcomes, like this is the worst thing that could happen, start from there, and then look and go down and go, what do we need to prevent this? It's really what a risk assessment is all about. Looking at what can happen, what would happen if it does happen, what's the consequence if it does happen, and then what do we need, what's the best way of making sure this doesn't happen, or if it does happen, we can respond really quickly, and the impact is very minimal, as your appetite allows. Those are good points to start.
Gotcha. And I think I've heard you say as well, there's a couple of things on that list that are pretty easy to check off right away. What would be some of the faster tasks that people might be able to check off on the HIPAA checklist right away?
Good ones to start with would be just putting naming a security officer in your organization and a privacy officer. It can be the same person that wears the two hats. In my case, like, I kind of wear those two hats in Securicy, but those are some easy things to start with. This is going to be a person who is responsible for making sure that the privacy rule is adhered to, and the security rule, you're in compliance in HIPAA or whatever security framework. If you have a security framework along with that you want to go with. Atop the list there was, selecting an information security framework as guidance. A lot of customers that work with, that offer cloud-based services and systems usually go with SOC 2 or kind of a CIS controls as frameworks for kind of guiding their information security practice.
I've got a question here on SOC 2 as well, so that's a perfect kind of segue. So so the question here is, how is HIPAA different from other framework requirements or best practices? So what are the differences? So if our company already meets SOC 2 security and privacy requirements, we've done those audits, what else do we need to do to become HIPAA compliant? So it sounds like these folks that would be farther along the track of getting towards HIPAA compliant.
Okay, so the question was, if you're already
if they're already
things for HIPAA, or
if they're already SOC 2 compliant.
Okay.
They've passed a SOC 2 audit.
There is some overlap there, so that's a good start, right? That's a huge chunk of it, addressed. Whereas if you have a SOC 2 and it's a type 1 or type 2 type, you pass this, you got that covered. I can assume that you have business continuity disaster recovery plans, that you have policies, you have incident response, incident management procedures, you have all of these things that are related to security, and you have a kind of a more mature information security program at your organization. That is a huge weight off your shoulders. Now you're going to take a look at, okay, do we have this, and are we using an encryption and pseudonymization or anonymization of data at any time that we can, at any point which we can, to kind of reduce the usefulness more than anything of the data if it does leak at any point. And then the privacy rule, a lot of that it's going to work together, but there's specific things for privacy. So like having notice of privacy practices that are specific to protected health information. And there's complaints handling, and then there's specific needs that you have to, there's those specific points in your policies that have to address anti-intimidation, anti-retaliation. So kind of like if someone is a whistleblower and says, we didn't do this, or if there's a complaint from a patient or from a user that about their protected health information, like you can't give them worse healthcare, you can't give them worse service, you can't retaliate, or you can't treat them any different for kind of exercising the rights, essentially. And then there's disclosure and use and disclosure of data that's a bit specific for HIPAA that you have to address.
Gotcha. And so you've mentioned at a point or another about audits. And so, yeah. Darren, I know you have a lot to say as having been on the side of being an auditor as well as being in a company that's being audited. So what do we need to know about HIPAA audits? How often do you actually get audited and who's doing them? So is like SOC 2, it's a third party. Who's actually doing the HIPAA audits? Is that kind of an annual requirement? What's the details around those?
It depends. So if a HIPAA audit happens and you're US and you're a covered entity, it's most likely going to be someone from DH or HHS or OCR, like someone who's a regulator that's making sure that enforcement rule is done. If you're a business associate, it's going to be the covered entity. It's going to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing in a contract, right? So it's their responsibility. They are responsible, and you are then liable under a contractual obligation.
And that's a lot of what that questionnaire is. It's essentially part of the process that your customer's third-party assessor or auditor would go through. So they would send out a questionnaire to you to ask questions about a variety of things around your security and your privacy and your practices in your organization. They'll then review that. They'll often want to get on a phone call. They sometimes will want to see more details on specific things, just to prove that there's no holes there, and then they develop a document on that, and that gets filed, and that's part of their due diligence that they've committed to their best practice requirement of assessing the vendors they work with, and so that's what that is essentially happening. As soon as you get that questionnaire, you are being audited by your customer or the organization that your customer is hired to manage their vendor assessments.
Yeah, and Darren, I know you have some really good advice on responding to questionnaires as well. So just kind of taking it a step farther from just being audited. So what should companies do when they actually get that questionnaire from a company that they know is asking about a lot of HIPAA things that they may or may not be prepared to answer back?
Yeah, I mean, if you're not ready, like if you're one of these companies that literally hasn't been thinking or caring about security or privacy or HIPAA, and you're just building your feature set in your customer, trying to grow your customer base or go after your business without thinking about that, and you don't have somebody in your organization who has strong knowledge of the concepts, then you're in a really tough You're in a really tough position when that questionnaire comes. Because it's highly probable that you're not going to know, you're not going to understand all the language in there. You're probably not doing a lot of the things that they're likely expecting that you are doing. So a lot of the things they're expecting, like you to say yes to, you may not be in a predicament to say yes. So if you've let it go, I mean, obviously the best case scenario is don't let it get to that situation. So think about this stuff earlier, as Justin referred to earlier: security by design, privacy by design. These are concepts that if you do them from the beginning, they will cost less, they will be easier, and when this situation comes about, you will be much more it'll be a much tighter gap to close to meet the requirements. You obviously don't want to lie. However, if you're blatantly honest, there's a high probability that you're going to lose the trust of the customer as well. So that's why I say you're in a really tough situation. It's a good time, if you're in that position, to hire somebody who knows how to solve your problem really quickly and who can jump in really quickly. Most companies will charge a premium for that fact that you're coming in unprepared with your hair on fire and time is of the essence. So again, you're going to end up spending more money, but I think you can't just go start saying yes to all this stuff. So if you do that, there's a couple of things that'll happen. The first one is maybe they won't look into it. Maybe they're slammed, or they don't have the bandwidth, or they just believe you. And then you just, yeah, we got through, we're good. Sure, but if there's the fraud thing Justin was talking about earlier, you said you're doing all these things, you're not. There's probably something in the BAA that's going to refer to it, and a few other scenarios there where you've basically, now you're lying. You're operating your business under a lie. I see a lot of people that do that. They'll lie and they'll say, okay, over the next couple of weeks, we need to clean this mess up. But that sense of urgency of cleaning those things up in the next couple of weeks, once the check's cashed, usually fades away, and things kind of stall, and you've already been a company that hasn't prioritized it. So you've basically set yourself up for that fraud situation. So that's obviously the wrong thing to do. You know, and the other one is the stalling one. Well, that's the scenario where you're taking 2 or 3 weeks to respond to the questionnaire because you're scurrying around as quickly as possible trying to make all the no's yeses, so you're not lying. The problem there is that you've changed the cadence, and an intelligent auditors knowing, oh, these guys are really, you know, they can tell you're scrambling and they can tell you're in that situation. So that usually doesn't excite customers. Oh, you didn't think about this? You didn't think about securing our data, and so now you're thinking about it now. You know, and I see other cases where companies will essentially lie with the internal commitment that before the agreement starts. That's a bit of a slippery slope because especially if you haven't already started the processes and you haven't engaged the right people, you know, you may not be able to turn that around quick enough. So yeah, I mean, it's a really tough situation. And then the other thing that happens, and I've seen this happen a lot of times, is when you lie and then in the questionnaire, and then, which this is a very common practice that an auditor will do, is like schedule a call, let's walk through it. So now you have to support your lies. And when you don't have things in place and you don't really have a really strong knowledge or domain expertise in security, your ability to you know, it's easy to say, yes, I have the thing, but then to explain how you've implemented the thing and how often that's going to get really hard when you're outside of your wheelhouse of skill set. So it's a really tough scenario. I think, you know, obviously the best case scenario is like get it together before the questionnaire comes. Even if it's like partially together, even the critical things, like, you know, so if you've got a, say for example, you're a dev shop or you build SaaS application, like if you're practicing like implementing OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, or some other sort of framework of information security around developing software, testing software, deploying software. If you're following things and you're, you know, doing some regular best practices anyways, that's already a hell of a lot further along than just blatantly not thinking about it. You know, and then the last thing I'll say, and this one kind of really blows my mind, but I've seen a lot of founders actually start digging the hole deeper. So they actually see people get defensive. So defensive about the security questionnaire. Like you know, I've had people comment, oh, this is ridiculous. We're 10-person startup. We only have like 8 months runway and they're throwing all this stuff at us. And like this, you know, we don't even know what half this means. Like, you know, you don't want to start saying to your customer like, oh, well, we're just a 5-person startup. So like, you know, because that's like, oh God, what do we get the customer starts thinking, what are we getting ourselves into? Like, these guys don't have the capacity. They're too young. They're not a mature company. Like, is this really, you know, so the risk for the person that's assessing your company, they're assessing the risk factors. How risky are you? You're telling them how risky you are as a validation for why you haven't gotten your shit together yet. So that's a really bad argument. Or the other one is like, well, you know, this looks really expensive, and you know, we're an early stage startup. We only have 6 months of runway. I've literally seen founders say that. What you're saying is you have an auditor that just assumes, because he's probably not thinking that you're going to go out of business anytime, and then they go, oh my God, what will happen if this company goes out of business in 6 months? What? So you're just flagging more concerns. So being defensive is really bad. And then the other one is like, you're not, just because a question is asked doesn't always mean that it's something you have to do. And this, I think, is where getting expert help is really important, because an expert can see that and understand that and advise on that a lot more than somebody who doesn't understand or doesn't have a lot of experience in cybersecurity. A lot of times the questionnaires are generic, so they're not molding the questionnaire around the engagement, because that's time consuming. So you're getting the same questionnaire that every vendor gets. So there's going to be things there that are completely unapplicable to your company, or that you don't necessarily have to do because of certain things. But you know, so it's to go out and just look at the questionnaire as like, oh my God, I got to do all these things. All those things aren't made equal, and there's arguments of where you could say, and I've done this when I help companies go through their first couple of times. I'll be like, all this stuff doesn't apply to your business, so we're just, instead of saying no, we're going to say non-applicable. Now that's great, non-applicable is way better than no, but you have to have a validating reason for non-applicability. You can't just go, oh, sweet, I love this non-applicable term. This is really making it easy. You've got to have a rationale. Like, this doesn't apply to us. You know, for example, like, do you do pen tests in your software? Not applicable. We don't develop software. If you don't develop software, then you don't have to do pen tests in your software. So that's an example, right? Or if you don't have an office, you don't have to have. But it's really hard for somebody who doesn't have the expertise. So getting somebody on board that has the expertise, you can learn a lot quickly. One thing that I notice, especially with technical founders or technical startups, is that once they've gone through the process 3 or 4 times, and once they've, especially when they've had expert help, that's somebody that can, it's a really educational process for them. And then they start building that confidence and the ability to talk about these things and justifying their position. So you're allowed to say, no, we don't do this. We do this instead. But if you don't understand the threat landscape and what the expectation is, and then the other thing is knowing what questions to ask. So I've often helped, like, told startups to go back to the auditor and ask a question like, hey, on question 111 says, please share your PCI or your ISO 27001 audit or your SOC your SOC 2 audit, or whatever. And it's like, well, ask them what they want. Is this a mandatory thing that they're asking for? If there's something that's not clear, you can ask that. But be careful there as well, because if it's a question that's not clear, but that's standard common body of knowledge language that the cybersecurity industry uses, then if you're saying, hey, what does this mean? Then it's like, oh shit, right? These guys don't even know what these things mean. So knowing what to push back on, knowing where to be able to use non-applicability as a reason to just sort of tighten the scope of what you need to do. You really do need expert opinions there. And I think, like, just because somebody, like, this word cybersecurity expert, cybersecurity is a massive domain, and there's a lot of different areas. And so, somebody who is a network security expert who works in a large organization that's all local area network based is probably not going to be able to give the best advice on, say, how your SaaS company that works out of a WeWork or remotely and is all built in the cloud using cloud applications and, say, an AWS or Azure environment. So having just my brother-in-law is a security expert. Well, it's kind of like lawyers, right? You don't hire a divorce lawyer to review your privacy policy on your website. So you do really want to make sure that you're talking to security professionals that understand and have experience in the type of organization that you are, the type of security requirements that apply to that organization or organizations like that.
Yeah, especially as it relates to HIPAA, I think that's great advice of making sure, you're not asking the wrong security expert if you're really trying to figure out is HIPAA applicable to us in this audit, in this questionnaire, which parts of HIPAA, what do we need to comply with, and really answering all of those big questions. And there's one final question here that I want to ask related to really this kind of central idea that we have in part of this webinar around how do you fast track it? How do you fast track HIPAA compliance? What are some things that's going to slow a company down, and what are some things that a company can do to speed up the process to get themselves HIPAA compliant?
Before Justin jumps in, because I know he has a lot of thoughts in this, the most important is getting help, because you can't, like, fast tracking doesn't mean the CTO spending 2 days reading about all this stuff online. That's 2 days lost. And I know, like, I know for myself, I remember back when my first startup, when I really didn't understand anything about privacy or security, and my first audit happened, I burnt like a week researching and reading a bunch of stuff that was not really the stuff that I should have been reading. And had I went out right then and there on that date and just hired a professional, brought somebody in who knew what they were doing, I would have moved a lot quicker, and I would have saved a deal that I lost at the time. That was one of the biggest deals that our company had ever had. So like the DIY scrappy bootstrap startup, I can do anything idea, when you have a customer right there and you need to act quickly. It's a big domain. You can't learn this overnight at the same time that you're implementing it, if fast tracking is priority number one.
Justin,
Yeah,
any advice for people asking that question?
That's a good point. Is there's people out there that have have been working on these kinds of security domains for many years, and even just getting like a short call and some help in areas that you're not very comfortable with, and advice as to like where to start. You know, I made the compliance checklist. I mean, going through some of those initial items that I suggested go through, the risk assessments, naming privacy and security officers. You know, those are good points to start. We have in the application, we do have, you know, business continuity disaster recovery plan. We help with that. We do have a lot of you know, things that we offer. We have a free account, and we also have you know, paid options and advisory services that we offer. So I mean, those are good points.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a great moment to, as we wrap up here with our last moment or two, to say, so as a company, we do information security and privacy. So Darren, do you want to say a little bit about what's inside of our application and some of the resources that we have inside of our free app and within Securicy that people can use to get started right away if they are looking, kind of starting from zero, or starting from maybe having some security privacy program, but really trying to take it up all the way to HIPAA compliance?
Yeah, so you know, our application we have a policy builder tool in there that's fairly intelligent, so it will build all your internal information security policies and give you a lot of guidance around procedures. There's task management in there that will basically break down the things that your team is going to need to implement in order to meet that compliance requirement. We also have reporting tools that will show you sort of where you're at, so you can sort of run your gap analysis once you go through and configure and check off the things you may have already done before engaging with the app. And then, you know, you can really plan out that project of implementing the security and monitoring the progress. You can also engage other people in your company, so the CEO can check in, or you know, anybody on the board. You can generate a report for them to show them how you're doing that. Those reports also become useful when customers ask. I would say being very preemptive is a great way to be about security. So if you actually preempt their security questionnaire with your really good security report, or HIPAA report in this case, there's a chance they may not send the security questionnaire. They may be, if your reporting is strong enough, it may actually suffice and save a bunch of time on your side. And it certainly shows, though, that your security is really solid when you have good reporting already built up. And you take that preemptive approach. You're not afraid of the question. You're not sitting there dreading in fear that question comes over. It's part of the process, and your salespeople have it, and they know how to deliver it. So those are some of the tools that we give through the application. And then, you know, we also have partnerships with other organizations that can help with more technical pieces of your technology stack or things like that. And then, you know, last but certainly not least, we also have professionals in-house that can help you directly. So if you have a fast track requirement, we can throw in hours of our own time to help you get through that. So we have packages like that. We're basically Justin can jump in and roll up his sleeves and help you guys get this thing put to play as quick as possible. I would say, how fast is it? Well, again, like Justin said, it depends on a lot of variables: size of your business, how good your security is, a whole bunch of things like that. But you know, with the right help and the right tools, you can move like 4, 5, 6 times faster than you would if you tried to do it traditional way. So you know, it might be a week, it might be 2, it might be 2 months, but I can guarantee you that, you know, using tools like this and having access to the expert advice is going to make it a lot faster than if you were to do it sort of the traditional way of sort of going about and doing the research and reading about it and writing your own policies and going through that process.
Doing it all in documents and spreadsheets.
Been there. Don't.
Yeah. Those hopefully anyone who's starting off trying to get to HIPAA compliance right now, we can help you avoid the miserable process of having to learn from scratch using documents, blank documents, templates that you're customizing and trying to figure out, do they apply to you, and those spreadsheets to track your gap analysis from scratch. So thanks for everyone who came today and who asks your questions. If you are interested in seeing what is in the Securicy app or using that checklist, you can have both of those resources as well, the free application as well as that checklist there. And then if you have any questions for us as a team, you can absolutely reach out and ask your questions directly to the Securicy team. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you.